There are moments in professional football where the game itself becomes secondary, where the real action isn't happening on the field, but behind closed doors, inside boardrooms, inside locker rooms, and inside the minds of people who have decided that the written rules only apply when it's convenient for them. What's unfolding in Cleveland right now is exactly that kind of moment. Two separate stories, two completely different situations, but both carrying the same DNA: power, control, and the uncomfortable question of whether the NFL actually plays by its own rulebook or simply pretends to when the cameras are rolling. One story involves a young quarterback whose path to the league got blocked by a wall that wasn't supposed to exist. The other involves a quarterback battle where the real competition might not be happening between the two players everyone's watching, but between loyalty, sabotage, and the invisible politics that never show up in a box score. Both of these situations are developing in real time, and neither of them is close to being resolved. So before training camp kicks off and the narrative gets buried under highlight reels and injury updates, let's pull back the curtain and walk through what's actually going on. Because if you've been following the Browns this offseason with any level of attention, you already know that something feels off. And once you understand the full picture, that feeling makes complete sense. Brandon Sorsby did what he was supposed to do. He looked at the rules, he consulted his legal team, and he submitted his application for the supplemental draft. On paper, based on the actual language written into the collective bargaining agreement, he met the criteria. The CBA's standard for supplemental draft eligibility is not complicated. It is not layered with hidden clauses or buried in footnotes. If a player was draft eligible in April, but their circumstances changed after that window closed, they qualify. That's the whole rule. That's the entire threshold. So when Sorsby and his team sent in that one-page application, which was all the league asked for, they weren't making a bold move for testing boundaries. They were simply following the process as it was written. They followed up to confirm everything was in order, they received no indication that anything was missing or insufficient, and then the rejection came anyway. The NFL's reasoning: they claimed there wasn't enough time to properly investigate Sorsby's situation, particularly the gambling accusations that surfaced, allegations that he had been betting on his own team's games while he was still a minor. They also argued that he hadn't demonstrated enough accountability for what happened. Here's the problem with that reasoning, and it's not a small problem, it is a fundamental one. Neither of those justifications exists anywhere in the CBA. Not the part about investigations needing more time, not the part about a player needing to pass some kind of accountability test before being considered eligible. The league essentially walked into a courtroom, pointed at a contract, and then enforced terms that weren't written anywhere in it. That's not interpretation, that's invention. If the NFL had come out and said something straightforward, if they had pointed to actual CBA language and argued that Sorsby should have known his eligibility was compromised back in April and that this disqualified him under the existing terms, that would have been a defensible position. People might have disagreed with it, but at least it would have been grounded in the actual written agreement. Instead, they created brand new standards on the spot and applied them retroactively to a player who had no way of knowing those standards would exist when he filed. And that inconsistency becomes almost impossible to ignore once you bring Josh Gordon into the conversation. Because Gordon didn't just have a complicated background when he entered the supplemental draft. He had failed multiple drug tests, he had been dismissed from his college program entirely. His record of violations was documented and extensive, and the NFL didn't slow down. They didn't announce that they needed more time. They didn't decide that Gordon needed to demonstrate accountability before they'd consider moving forward. They conducted the supplemental draft and admitted him without hesitation.
So the question writes itself. Why did Josh Gordon get one version of the rules and Brandon Sorsby get a completely different one? What changed? What principle is the league actually protecting here? Because it's clearly not consistency, and it's clearly not a strict reading of the agreement both sides signed. The Deshaun Watson situation adds another uncomfortable layer to this. When Watson's suspension came down from a federal judge, the NFL reviewed it, decided the ruling wasn't severe enough, and pushed to have it extended. They got what they wanted. That episode confirmed something that a lot of people already suspected, but weren't ready to say out loud. The NFL operates as though precedent and established process are optional. When the league wants a different outcome, it finds a mechanism to produce one. The rulebook isn't a constraint, it's a starting point that gets adjusted based on what result the people in power have already decided they want. There is a pattern in this league that doesn't get discussed often enough, partly because it's uncomfortable, and partly because the evidence is spread across years and names that don't always get connected to each other. But once you start connecting them, the picture becomes hard to dismiss. Colin Kaepernick took a knee. He was exercising a right that exists in this country, making a statement that had nothing to do with his performance on the field, and within a short period of time, he was effectively finished in the NFL. No team gave him a genuine shot. No team treated him the way a quarterback with his record would have been treated under normal circumstances. He didn't disappear because his arm gave out. He disappeared because he made the league uncomfortable. Brian Flores filed a lawsuit alleging discriminatory hiring practices in the NFL's coaching search process. His path to a head coaching position went nowhere shortly after that lawsuit became public. Whether you believe his claims or not, the timing is difficult to look past. The league has a documented history of making things difficult for people who challenge its authority through official channels. That history matters right now because Jeffrey Kessler and his team are not backing down. Kessler is the same attorney who fought the NCAA on Sorsby's behalf previously, and according to everything that has come out of his camp, they intend to pursue this. That means the league is going to have to decide whether it wants to dig in and fight or find a way to resolve this quietly. And based on how the NFL has handled similar situations in the past, digging in feels like the more likely outcome. Some analysts are already raising a concern that has a cold logic to it. They're warning that Sorsby intensifying this legal battle could make NFL front offices view him as more trouble than he's worth before he's ever taken a snap in the league. In a business that values control above almost everything else, a player who is willing to take his prospective employer to court gets labeled as a risk. That label can follow a player into draft rooms and free agent negotiations in ways that never fully go away. It's worth being direct about something here, though. That risk is real, but it doesn't make the fight wrong. Not everyone grew up inside a system where you learn early to keep your head down, play along, and wait your turn without making noise. Not everyone was handed that unwritten rule book and told to memorize it. And frankly, not everyone should have to operate by it. If the written rules say you're eligible, following those written rules isn't rebellion. It isn't troublemaking. It's just reading what was agreed to and expecting it to be honored. From where things stand right now, Sorsby has a few directions he can go, and none of them are without complications. The most aggressive path is continuing the legal challenge with Kessler's team, attempting to either force his way into this supplemental draft cycle or establish a legal precedent that protects future players in similar situations. That route takes time, costs money, and carries the reputational risk that was just discussed. But it also has the potential to accomplish something much larger than one quarterback's draft status. If the NFLPA decides to step in and argue that the league is selectively enforcing its own agreement, this stops being a story about Brandon Sorsby and becomes a story about the fundamental question of whether the NFL is actually bound by the contracts it signs. That's a much bigger fight. That's the kind of dispute that reshapes how collective bargaining in professional football goes forward.
The second path is becoming an undrafted free agent and trying to earn a roster spot without the structure and guaranteed money that a draft selection provides. It's a harder road. It puts him in a position where he has less leverage and fewer protections, but it gets him into an NFL building, and for some players, that's been enough of a foothold to build something real. The third option is waiting, entering the 2027 draft, letting the legal noise settle, and allowing this whole chapter to become background context rather than the first thing every team thinks about when his name comes up. That path requires patience and a willingness to let a year of professional development go by, which is genuinely costly at the start of a career. But it also gives the league time to move on to the next controversy, which it always does.
What's clear is that this situation is not resolving quietly or quickly. Attorneys like Kessler don't typically invest this kind of energy into a case they're planning to walk away from. And the precedent question hanging over this, whether the NFL can invent eligibility criteria whenever it finds existing criteria inconvenient, is the kind of thing that courts tend to find worth examining. While the Sorsby situation plays out in legal filings and press statements, something entirely different is developing inside the Browns building itself. This one doesn't involve lawyers or collective bargaining language. It involves quarterbacks, receivers, locker room loyalty, and the kind of tension that shows up on film but never in a box score. The reports coming out of Cleveland suggest that Deshaun Watson is expected to start the season and may be given a 6-week window to prove that he's still the player the Browns believed they were getting when they made one of the most controversial acquisitions in recent NFL history. Before anyone takes that report and runs too far with it, though, it's worth slowing down and being precise about what it actually means. A report from a media personality claiming to have a source inside the building is not a guarantee. It is not a signed memo from the front office. It could reflect genuine organizational thinking. It also could reflect what one person in the building believes is the direction things are heading, which is a very different thing. Belief and outcome are not the same. And in quarterback competitions especially, the gap between what people expect at the start of training camp and what actually happens once the pads go on can be enormous. What the spring actually showed was more competitive than the leaked narrative suggests. Reports from mandatory minicamp indicated that Shedeur Sanders had closed the gap considerably. He showed up and performed in a way that made the competition feel real, not like a formality designed to protect Watson's starting spot. Yes, Watson appeared to have a slight edge in the eyes of some observers as minicamp wrapped up, but slight edges in the spring have a way of evaporating once training camp starts and the intensity increases. So the honest read on this going into camp is that it's genuinely open. Whether what's being reported reflects that reality is a separate question entirely. There is a name that has come up repeatedly in connection with the insider information leaking out of Cleveland about this quarterback battle: Jeudy. And the reason this matters enough to discuss in detail is not just gossip or speculation. It's about what the source of information means for the competition itself. The details that have been surfacing about this quarterback battle are not the kind of information you get from someone reading tea leaves or making educated guesses from the outside. Todd Monken runs a tight operation. Those practice sessions are closed. The specific details that have been making their way into media reports, the kind of granular information about what's happening inside closed practices, can only come from someone who has authorized access to those sessions, someone who is trusted enough to be in the room, not someone standing outside the facility with a pair of binoculars. When you look at where this information has been surfacing and trace the connections back to their source, a pattern emerges. Reports that frame Watson favorably, that present the competition as more settled than the on-field evidence suggests, keep finding their way into the conversation through channels that can be connected to people with a personal relationship to Jeudy. That pattern has appeared consistently enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires more effort than accepting it as meaningful. Now, to be clear, this is a theory built on observable patterns, not confirmed facts. The connections are suggestive, not definitive, but patterns matter, and this one has shown up enough times to deserve scrutiny. Here is where the Jeudy situation moves from interesting gossip into something that has genuine on-field consequences. Because if a receiver inside that building is not fully committed to whoever is throwing him the ball, the damage that does to a quarterback's evaluation is real, and it is largely invisible to the people doing the evaluating. Think about what it actually means on a route-by-route basis. A receiver who isn't fully bought in doesn't sprint the full distance of his route on every rep. He doesn't extend his body and sacrifice himself for a contested catch in traffic. He doesn't fight for that extra yard after the catch when the play matters but the down isn't critical. And when those things happen consistently enough, the quarterback starts to look like the problem. The stat sheet shows incomplete passes. The film shows misconnections.
Analysts watching from the outside begin drawing conclusions about accuracy, timing, and chemistry, and none of those conclusions account for the possibility that the receiver's effort level was the variable that changed. The tape has already provided some evidence here. There have been moments where Jeudy's effort and commitment on the field appeared to fluctuate in ways that correlated with who was throwing him the ball, plays where the extension wasn't there, moments where the hustle after the catch disappeared. Those inconsistencies were less frequent with certain quarterbacks than others. That's not a random statistical blip, that's a pattern on film, and patterns on film mean something. The reason this keeps coming back to Shedeur Sanders specifically is that he is the one with everything to lose from this dynamic. If Sanders is putting in the work, making the right reads, delivering accurate passes, but the receiver on the other end of those passes is giving 60% effort because of a personal preference for a different quarterback, the evaluation system has no mechanism for separating those two things. The stat sheet doesn't record effort. The scoreboard doesn't track locker room loyalty. What gets recorded is the outcome of the play. And if that outcome is negative because of a factor that had nothing to do with the quarterback's decision-making, the quarterback absorbs the blame anyway.
Public perception doesn't ask whether the receiver sold out his route. It watches the ball fall incomplete and starts asking questions about the quarterback's arm, or his reads, or his composure under pressure. That's the invisible tax that locker room politics places on a quarterback's development, and it's one of the most underreported dynamics in professional football. Shedeur Sanders has real ability. That's not a charitable interpretation of a modest performance, it's what the spring showed. He made progress throughout the offseason program that was tangible and documented by people who were watching closely. The competition is real, it is close, and he has every reason to believe he can win it on merit. But merit operates inside a context. And the context around this quarterback competition includes factors that have nothing to do with arm talent, footwork, or football IQ. It includes who controls the narrative coming out of that building. It includes whether the people around a quarterback are giving him everything they have or quietly rooting for someone else. It includes whether the information being distributed to the media reflects what's actually happening on the field or reflects the preferences of whoever is doing the distributing. Watson has the established reputation, the massive contract, and apparently at least some voices inside the building speaking loudly on his behalf. Sanders has the momentum from the spring, the promise, and the kind of competitive drive that tends to show up when the pads go on and the evaluations become real. What Sanders doesn't have, at least not obviously, is the same level of political infrastructure working in his favor. That imbalance doesn't determine the outcome, but it shapes the conditions under which the outcome gets decided, and anyone who watches this competition unfold over the coming weeks without accounting for those conditions is watching an incomplete picture. Pull back far enough, and both of these situations, the Sorsby legal dispute and the Watson-Sanders quarterback battle, are telling the same story from different angles. They're both about who actually has power in the NFL and how that power gets exercised when it's not being publicly scrutinized. In Sorsby's case, the power being exercised is institutional. The league decided it didn't want a particular outcome and manufactured new standards to prevent it. No court has weighed in yet. No independent body has reviewed the decision and found it inconsistent. But the inconsistency is sitting right there in the open, documented and visible to anyone willing to look at what the actual agreement says versus what justification the NFL offered. In Cleveland's case, the power being exercised is interpersonal. It's quieter. It doesn't show up in press releases or official statements. It shows up in what gets leaked, what gets framed, and how the competition gets described before a single regular season snap has been taken. It shows up in whether a receiver runs his route with full effort or with just enough to avoid being cut in September. Both of these stories are about the gap between the official version of events and what's actually happening. Both of them involve people in positions of relative power shaping narratives in ways that serve their own interests. and both of them are going to continue developing in ways that are impossible to fully predict right now. The Sorsby case will likely see legal filings, possible NFLPA involvement, and a determination about whether courts find the NFL's position defensible under the language of the actual agreement. The Cleveland quarterback battle will play out in training camp, in preseason games, in practice film that gets analyzed by coaches who may or may not be evaluating both players with equal investment in the outcome. What's worth sitting with after all of this is a question that doesn't have a clean answer. In a league this powerful, this wealthy, and this structurally resistant to being challenged, what does it actually take for the written rules to mean what they say? Because right now, in Cleveland and in NFL headquarters, the answer to that question appears to be, it depends on who's asking and whether the people in charge want them to have what the rules say they're owed. That answer should bother you, and something tells me it's going to keep coming up before any of this is finished.